Stop recording.
Hello everyone on YouTube, it's Jordan here again, bringing you another video, and today I want to talk about my opinion on Accessible Coconut, which is, of course, as you know, a Linux distro designed for the blind and visually impaired. It is based on Ubuntu, and that's all we know about it. There's not that much info about it. So I'm going to make sure I've got some lighting on in here before I go ahead and chat. I also want to know your opinions down there in the comments too. What do you think? And do you know any alternatives? I certainly know some alternative distros that you can use, and in my opinion, they're much better than Accessible Coconut. Linux Mint Mate Edition, for instance. So it says on SourceForge that Accessible Coconut is entirely based off Ubuntu Mate. It is, but it hasn't got the Ubuntu Mate desktop package installed. In other words, if you tapped into a terminal sudo apt install Ubuntu Mate desktop, it would go ahead and install the missing packages. For instance, you don't have the Ubuntu, well, you do have the Ubuntu Mate guide, but you don't have the Ubuntu Mate welcome screen, so it's not entirely based off Ubuntu Mate, it's just got the standard Mate desktop. And another thing that they don't tell you about Accessible Coconut is, although Orca is brilliant, I like how it comes with Orca when it's started. You don't have to press the keystroke once the live installer boots. The voice is questionable. I'm starting to head into intermediate Linux territory. As someone who's used Ubuntu Mate, Linux Mint, and the standard Ubuntu, and given Fedora a whirl, I like eSpeak as it is. I don't like the modifications that they've done to eSpeak and Orca. So that just leave Orca as it is by default, like Ubuntu Mate did. And the settings are questionable. Orca's reading commands, it doesn't read by sentence by default. You have to manually set that. You can't install Accessible Coconut without having to tweak it first to work like a regular Linux distro, because there's so many things you've got to do. Like you've got to fix broken packages, because it does come with broken packages. You've got to tweak Orca to your liking, and it's just time consuming. Linux Mint has none of that. You may have to do the odd few now and again, but not as much as you do in Accessible Coconut. And if there's anything about niche Linux distros like Accessible Coconut, the chances are it's going to head down the same path as Linux did in the near future. Even though Linux did have an entry on DistroWatch, Accessible Coconut doesn't even have an entry on DistroWatch because it just doesn't have that many users. And the reason why is because there are better Linux distros out there. And as someone who's used Accessible Coconut, it's not that I don't like the distro, it's the fact that not many people are aware of it. And because of that, I've just gone to mainstream Linux distros, which are accessible anyway if you enable the features. I mean, there isn't really any such thing as a Linux distro for the blind, because most Linux distros can be configured to work with the visually impaired. I mean, look at Ubuntu. Ubuntu's been doing it for years. I mean, I believe it started on Ubuntu 12.04, codenamed Precise Pangolin, where it actually introduced Orca, and Linux is actually based off of Ubuntu 12.04. Well, the Linux 4.0 anyway, or it might have been Ubuntu 10.04, which actually introduced the first version of Orca. And this is how Linux was born. I don't know the full details, but anyway, hands down, Ubuntu is the #1 distro that blind people like me or visually impaired people like me will flock to when they want to try Linux. But they're not aware of something like, they're not aware of other alternatives like, for example, Linux Mint, which is based off Ubuntu, and they're not aware that, well, some people are aware that Orca comes with it, other people's aren't. And I personally love Linux Mint. It's a lot better than Accessible Coconut in the way that it's more organised, it's not bloated. I mean, if you look at the software in Accessible Coconut, there is software that isn't even accessible. VLC, for instance, part of it is, but not all of it is. I mean, if you want to go ahead into your playback settings, you can't reliably do that with Orca. And I personally think that the developers should have taken more time to look at the software that does work with Orca and decide accordingly. Because while VLC works with Windows screen readers and Mac screen readers, well, the only Mac screen reader being VoiceOver, Orca, the accessibility of VLC is questionable. I mean, navigating the menus, and that's what bothers me and stuff. But I only use VLC on the Mac. I mean, there are better media players out there for Linux. Parole Media Player is one of them. You've also got Rhythmbox, but you can't play MIDI on Rhythmbox. You've got Celluloid, you've got Audacious, you've got Curlew, should you need it. And then there are questionable software, Charada Braille Writer, another piece of bloatware. I mean, if you're not going to be using Braille displays on your computer, then you're not really going to be needing the software or the distro itself. I mean, Linux didn't come that bloated. If you look at Linux, it had most of the software you'd have on a standard Ubuntu install. It had LibreOffice, it had Xterm, it had Mate iSeal, it had ClamTK, although you didn't really need it, but it was there if you did. Linux had a better software selection than Accessible Coconut currently does. And even better, Linux had an official repository. So did Sonar Linux, which is another accessible version of Linux. Accessible Coconut currently uses a PPA, and PPAs, they're private package archives, so they're not really official repositories. And I'm alright with PPAs, it's just that the actual official PPA doesn't have that many software. It only comes with the software that comes with the distribution, i.e. the script that makes Tux Math and Tux Typing accessible. Those games are good, by the way. You should check those out. They're good Linux games. You don't even have to be visually impaired to play them. And another thing I got a question as well is why are there broken packages with the distro? I mean, if you want to update LibreOffice, the latest version of Accessible Coconut comes with a broken LibreOffice base package, so even if you try and install it, it won't let you. And there are packages that can't be upgraded. And in order to fix those, you have to install Aptitude. Now, Aptitude, in my opinion, is better than Apt. I prefer Aptitude to Apt. It's more streamlined. I absolutely love the way that it handles packages. It will tell you what dependencies are needed and will automatically resolve those if needs be. Apt doesn't. It just keeps those dependencies unresolved. Oh, and what if you can't? What if you mess up your system and you haven't installed Aptitude yet? Well, I'm afraid your system is messed up and you'll have to do a reinstall. Linux Mint doesn't do that. Linux Mint comes with Aptitude already installed with the distro. It doesn't come with any bloatware like Accessible Coconut does. It removes all the weird stuff that was introduced in Ubuntu, like snaps. It runs excellent on low-powered hardware. It runs excellent with the Mate desktop environment. It's got a brilliant community. It's the Linux Mint community is more active than the Accessible Coconut group, that's for sure. I mean, I go on the Accessible. I'm a member of the Accessible Coconut group. I like to help out, but I occasionally go on to check for any new updates. But the last update was from a few weeks ago when they released 20.04.4. It's just this distro people need to be aware of this distribution. I've done a video on installing Accessible Coconut if you want to see that. And in my opinion, although I like the distribution, I've seen better distros, Linux Mint being one of them. If they could base the distro entirely on Linux Mint, then more and more people would use Accessible Coconut. But as it stands, Ubuntu Mate, while it's good, I love Ubuntu Mate, it doesn't reap the benefits of Linux Mint. For instance, if you want to install packages without using the terminal, Linux Mint 20.1, Ulissa, it featured, if you were to search for KDE Connect, even if it wasn't installed, and in the search box, it would offer you the option to install it as a suggestion, and you could go ahead and install it without needing to use the terminal. And even better, it will close the installer down once it's done installing. Ubuntu Mate or Accessible Coconut doesn't do that, even if you add the Mint repositories. So what needs to happen is Accessible Coconut needs to remove its Ubuntu Mate base and focus with Linux Mint. Then again, it'll still be based on Ubuntu 20.04, but you'd also have a Linux Mint-like experience. It would feel more like Mint. You'd still have a link to the Linux Mint community if you need it. Also the Accessible Coconut group. I just feel Linux Mint would have been a better option for Accessible Coconut rather than Ubuntu. Or even better, Debian, because Debian is the granddad of Ubuntu, Linux Mint, and Accessible Coconut. Another thing that annoys me about Accessible Coconut, and a lot of people will agree with me on this one, but the Software Boutique, it's not accessible. Even though it does work with Orca to some extent, you can't use the arrow keys if you keep tabbing. It won't read a lot of the thing. And the majority of times you're going to want to look for a different software manager or just use the terminal. So the one that I know that is accessible right out of the box, if you're used to using normal Ubuntu, is the GNOME software. You can get that by typing sudo apt or aptitude install gnome-orca. Oh no, gnome-software. Oh, we'll touch on Orca in a bit. And yeah, you do your usual stuff, get that installed, and you're ready to start installing software. And another thing to talk about is package upgrades. Very rarely have I seen the only time you need to check for upgrades on the Accessible Coconut is after you've installed the distro and configured everything. I've not seen any of these software packages get any updates, especially from the Accessible Coconut PPAs. The only updates you get are from the Ubuntu software repositories. There needs to be more activity in the PPAs for Accessible Coconut. I mean, look at the version of Orca that comes with Accessible Coconut. 3.36.4, which is also the version of GNOME you would get if you installed GNOME Desktop. The latest version of GNOME, and indeed Orca, is GNOME Forte, otherwise known as 3.40.0. And that has better features. I haven't tried it fully, because there's no way of actually getting that version of GNOME on Ubuntu. You can upgrade Orca to the latest Git commit, which does include the features that are in Orca 3.40, but it's just it's pointless. You're better off sticking to a mainstream distro that constantly gets updates, that has a friendly community, and that is really good with beginners. I mean, Linux Mint doesn't mention any accessibility tools on their website like Ubuntu does, but they're there when you need them. I mean, configuring Orca is as simple as pressing the Super plus Alt plus S keyboard shortcut when you're in a live session and installing it from there. And personally, though, it's all a matter of personal preference. I mean, I prefer Linux Mint. Some people will prefer Ubuntu Mate. Some visually impaired users will prefer Accessible Coconut, but keep in mind that Accessible Coconut could reach its end of life at any time. The project could end up closing down, even though that the base version of Ubuntu is you're still getting security updates from Ubuntu until April 2025. None of the official packages of Accessible Coconut will be upgraded. It happened to Linux. Linux, the last version of Linux was based off Ubuntu 14 Trusty Tar, and that version of Ubuntu happened to be an LTS release. It was supported up until 2019. Linux closed its project down back in 2017 when they planned to merge with Sonar and use Fedora as a base. But that didn't mean that even though Linux had reached its end of life, you were still getting security updates from Ubuntu right up until 2019, but you were no longer getting any updates from the Linux repositories. And I feel that Accessible Coconut is going to take the same road too. So the distro really does need improving. So what are your options then for visually impaired people then? Accessible Coconut is fine for now, but I do warn you, it's unpredictable. It could reach its end of life at any moment, even though it is getting support from Ubuntu, the Ubuntu repositories, until April 2025, because of the Ubuntu 20.04 is an LTS. You could try Linux Mint. I mean, my mission is to try all sorts of other distros when I can. Linux Mint is actively maintained. It's an active distro, and the latest version of Linux Mint is 20.1, codenamed Nulissa, and it's based off of Ubuntu 20.04, using Ubuntu 20.04 package base like Accessible Coconut, but it's more organized. The Mate desktop is not bloated. It's not messed up. It knows where to find drivers. It's got a better update manager. It's got a really good community, as I said before. It's constantly getting new things added to it. Oh man, I just love that distro. And well, that's all I can say. So guys, that was my video opinion on Accessible Coconut. I want to know what your opinion is on the comments, because I do feel that this distro isn't getting the recognition it deserves. It is brilliant, but it's not getting the distro it deserves. And because of this, it is at risk of reaching its end of life. I mean, Linux went down the same path. I mean, because nobody liked Fedora at the time. Fedora itself isn't accessible. And Sonar users were used to using an Arch package base with Manjaro. It was like the Sonar and Linux community were like, we want to stick with the Ubuntu base or the Arch base. So they reached their end of life right at the exact same time, even though they were still getting security updates from the base distro, Ubuntu for Linux, and obviously Arch or Manjaro for Sonar Linux. So unless Accessible Coconut gets an entry on DistroWatch and has a bigger community than it actually is, then it's at risk of reaching its end of life very quickly. So, this is what happens with Linux distros that people just aren't using. Even though mainstream Linux distros have a set time period before their end of life, there are those distros that will reach their end of life without notice. Again, Linux being one of them. But I want to know what you think. This is Jordan signing off saying have a good day, everyone.
Show can't stop recording.